We're good? We're live? All right, I'm going to give you a couple minutes here to stare at the screen, see if you can fill in the blanks of this review of Mark chapters 1 to 4. So look in silence. We're still going to have some people trickling in, of course, over the next few minutes. So if you want to look and make your best guess on these blanks, and we'll go over them in just about 60 seconds or so. Okay. Give it your best shot. Shout it out, and we'll go with it. Mark chapter 1, Jesus announces his kingdom as a kingdom of, it is the kingdom of God. So how can I say that's wrong, but it's not what I have. It's the kingdom of healing and freedom, okay? And what I've tried to do there, the word kingdom shows up multiple times in Mark 1. It says that Jesus is proclaiming the gospel, which we connected back to some Old Testament passages, that the good news is the kingdom of God coming or God reigning. But Jesus is saying the kingdom of God is at hand. The kingdom is at hand. The healing has to do with him literally healing the diseases of many that he comes in contact with. The freedom has more to do with the casting out of demons that we see in Mark 1 and the other chapters happening very often. He's freeing people, liberating people from the bondage to Satan, okay? So Jesus is coming on the scene, announcing his kingdom. Mark chapter 2 and 3, we saw that people do what? Anybody? Yeah, Cecilio's on it. He said they're trying to stop him or kind of, throw up roadblocks. The word we're going to use is object. In Mark 2 and 3, for the first time, you see mainly which group objecting? Yeah, the Pharisees and the scribes, okay, for the most part. And they are objecting, they are questioning what Jesus is doing, what he is saying, okay? So we say that people are objecting to Jesus' mission to make sinners what, Rick? Whole. Okay, I'm assuming Rick wrote these down, or he's been looking at my PowerPoint slides because he's teaching for me next week. So he's ahead of the game. But remember, one of the objections in Mark 2 is the fact that Jesus is spending time with the tax collectors and the sinners. And he says, I'm the physician, so who has he come for? Sinners, the sick, right? To make them whole. And by the way, that's one of the places where we see all of the healing that Jesus is doing, the healing of physical infirmities. When he says, I'm the physician come to make sinners whole, we see that all the healing that he's doing is really a picture of the greater healing that he has come to do as the great physician. That is to cure us of our sin, right? And then in Mark 4, the chapter of parables, we see that Jesus' kingdom is for those with what kind of ears? Open or? Hearing. Yeah, there we go. Hearing ears, open ears. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And what kind of hearts? Open would be good. I'm going to say humble. Hearing ears and humble hearts. That's who Jesus' kingdom is for, which in some ways helps to explain why those in Mark 2 and 3 are objecting and finding themselves on the outside, because they're coming to Jesus with a certain amount of pride, self-righteousness, assuming that they have all the answers, okay? And who is Jesus to come around and say something different, right? So in contrast to that, in Mark 4, the kingdom is for those who have that good and honest heart of the sower's parable of the sower, right? That hearing ears, willing to hear, willing to learn, willing to figure it out, and humble to receive even a message that is difficult and challenging. Okay? So that gets us up to where we are tonight in Mark chapter 4, verse 35. Now, I know I keep saying, every class period, I say, we can't always read the text in class because it's a lot, and then we usually read it, okay? So we're going to read it again tonight, but it's not an empty threat. There is coming a time where we won't have time to read the entire of the text in class, but let's do it tonight. We're going to read about 4 miracles that are told in succession here in Mark 4 and 5. So let's read it all together. It should take about 5 or 6 minutes. Mark 4, verse 35 beginning, all the way through Mark 5 to the end of the chapter. Mark 4, verse 35. And on that day when evening came, he said to them, let us go over to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling up. And Jesus himself was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. And they got him up and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Silence, be still. And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, Why are you so cowardly? Do you still have no faith? And they became very afraid, and were saying to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Chapter 5. Then they came to the other side of the sea, into the region of the Gerasenes. And when he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him, who had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one was able to bind him any more, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. And constantly, night and day, among the tombs and in the mountains, he was screaming and gashing himself with stones. And seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, do not torment me. For he had been saying to him, Come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And he was asking him, What is your name? And he said to him, My name is Legion, for we are many. And he began pleading with him earnestly not to send them out of the region. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. And the demons pleaded with him, saying, Send us into the swine, so that we may enter them. And Jesus gave them permission. And coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine. And the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. And their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and in the countryside. And the people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and observed the demon-possessed man sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion. And they became frightened. And those who had seen it recounted to them how this had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. And they began to plead with him to leave their region. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was pleading with him that he might accompany him. And he did not let him, but he said to him, Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. And he went away and began to preach the Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone was marveling. Mark 5, verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and so he stayed by the seashore. And one of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, and on seeing him, fell at his feet and pleaded with him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come, that by coming you may lay your hands on her, so that she will be saved and live. And he went off with him. And a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse, after hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his garment, for she was saying, If I just touch his garments, I will be saved from this. And immediately the flow of her blood was dried up. And she knew within her body that she had been healed of her affliction. And immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and was saying, Who touched my garments? And his disciples were saying to him, You see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, Who touched me? And he was looking around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official, saying, Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore? But Jesus, overhearing what had been spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he allowed no one to accompany him, except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion and people loudly crying and wailing. And entering in, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and crying? The child has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him. But putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions, and entered the room where the child was. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the little girl stood up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. And he said that some food should be given to her to eat. Okay, 4 miracles in this section. What are they? Jesus calmed the storm at the end of chapter 4. What comes next? Yeah, the demons, the legion of demons in chapter 5 that are cast out. What's after that? Yeah, the woman with the hemorrhage, the flow of blood. And then finally, yeah, the raising of Jairus' daughter. Now, all of these, by the end of class, we're going to try to put all of these together. But for now, I want to do this in pairs. I want to split you up into groups. And group 1, let's do group 1 through here. So the section on my right, and everybody in the back, or at least H.E. and Mike and Maddie, okay? And see what group Shannon wants to join. Why don't you come over here, Shannon? Over here. You can join group 1. Perfect, okay? And then group 2, you'll be everybody else. And you don't have to talk all together as a group, but get with the people near you and discuss. If you're in group 1, that's over here on the south side, then you're going to talk about the connections. Remember, we were talking about stitches in a quilt, right? What are the connections between the story of calming the sea and the story of casting out the legion of demons? What details, what ideas, themes, or interesting, pieces of setting or character, whatever it is, what ties these two stories together? Okay, and then what does that tell us? So we haven't done this in previous classes, but tonight I'm asking you to do all of these questions kind of at once. So not only what connects these stories together, but what does that tell us about Jesus? What do we learn about Jesus from seeing these two stories as kind of connected accounts here? Group 2, you're going to do the exact same thing, but with the second pair of stories, the healing of the woman with the flow of blood and the raising of Jairus' daughter. What connects the stories, and what does that tell us about Jesus? Any questions? Anybody unclear on what the assignment is? Cool. Go. I'll tell you when we're going to reconvene. Go ahead and talk about it for the next several minutes. Okay. I think your finger thumb width is up here, Rick. And Nathan is holding the torch, the microphone. So, group 1, calming of the sea and casting out of the legion. What did you see that holds these stories together, connects them, and what does that tell us about Jesus?
Demons. He could do anything. He wasn't limited to one thing.
Okay. Power over seas, power over the demons. Unlimited, Dan says. Thank you. Other things? Yeah, Kim.
For the man who had all the demons, but he also had compassion for his disciples that were afraid.
Compassion, linking these. Compassion can be tough sometimes, right? He can get onto them, but still, he does. He has compassion for his disciples when they're afraid, overwhelmed by fear, and he has compassion for this man who's overwhelmed by his demon possession. Absolutely. What else from these two stories? This is good stuff. Terry?
There was fear in both of them. Fear of the disciples because he had the power, and the demons had a fear of Jesus as well.
Okay. Now let's go through this one a little bit more here. Thank you, Terry. The disciples in the boat. Terry says they're afraid of him because of his power. What else are the disciples afraid of in the text? They're afraid in the boat, right? We get that because Jesus' response to them in verse 40 is, why are you so fearful, or why are you so cowardly? So they're afraid of the storm, and then he calms the storm. And as Terry points out, interestingly, their response is that they're in fear of him. I mean, if you're afraid of a storm, you're probably going to be afraid of a guy who stands up in a boat and tells the storm to, cut it out, right? And it does it, right? And then in the next story, the demons are afraid. I hadn't thought about that, Terry. That's good. The demons are afraid. Is there any other fear in that story, in the story of the demons? Thank you, Mike. The people were afraid when they show up and see this guy who had been crazy, half an hour ago, now like sitting down and wearing clothes and listening to Jesus speak, right? So there's a lot of fear throughout these stories here. Very cool. Thank you. What else you see here in these two stories in particular? Yeah, Shannon.
In both stories, you go from a situation where things are seem wild and out of control to calm, because Jesus calmed them. Whether he calms the sea or, that guy, goes from being crazy guy to just sitting there.
Yeah. Thank you, Shannon. You go from out of control, crazy. What do you think is going to stress you out more? Maybe it's all personal opinion here. Who in here is more stressed out being in a little boat in the middle of the sea with raging storms and the boat filling up with water, right? Who's more stressed out with that one? Who's more stressed out with the crazy guy who lives in tombs and gashes himself, running full steam ahead at you, screaming his head off? Who's more unnerved by that one? Okay, it's like, I don't know which one to pick, right? Both of these, as Shannon points out, a lot of craziness, a lot of out of control, but the story ends in calm and stillness in both instances, as she points out, because of Jesus. Okay, thank you, Shannon. Anything else from group one? Okay. Group two, the healing of the unclean woman and the raising of Jairus' daughter. What ties these stories together? And what do we learn? Okay, Brian's got the mic, but I want the mic to be passed around. Group one did a great job. We spread it out. We moved the ball, and we didn't take any shots until there was at least 3 passes. So.
I will pass it, please. Well, one of the first things we saw is, as not alluded to, but it's spoken of in group one, fear. The disciples were afraid after Jesus calmed the sea. The demons clearly fear Jesus. And also the people who witnessed the miracle feared Jesus and pushed him away. And then, of course, you had the woman who had the hemorrhaging, was afraid and trembling after Jesus had healed her. And then finally, you bring it all together, Jesus tells the synagogue official, do not be afraid, only believe. And so you see a connection, those with faith, like the possessed man in group one, he wanted to go with Jesus while the others wanted to push him away. So you see a connection between being at peace in believing in Christ and being afraid when you did not. For inexplicable reasons. You witness a miracle and don't rejoice. You're afraid after Jesus calms the ocean. I don't know. Okay, that's one, and I'll pass it to somebody.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So more fear. Fear shows up in every story we've said, all 4 across the board. And Rick, it's hot potato, man. You're stuck with it. Come on.
I guess Albert won't take it. I think we noted the role of faith, not only in the group, but in group one. And so as you look at group one, the disciples didn't have faith and had to be shown that they should. And then we see that the demons had faith, and then they knew that they had to listen to Jesus, obey him, and that he had authority. And then we get to the unclean woman. She had faith enough to come up behind him to touch his garment. But Jairus had to be told, you need to believe. And so these different aspects of how faith was interwoven into all 4 of these cases. And at the end of the day, we know that our faith needs to be strong enough to listen to what Jesus said, follow his commands, and then we know we're on good ground because he's established his authority here through all of these things.
Okay, thank you, Rick. So faith in every story, and as Rick points out, kind of the result of faith being to listen, to obey, right, to do what Jesus tells us to do. Thank you, Rick. Albert, I think everyone is just trying to hand you the mic. It's both. Yeah.
So a thought that came to me while we were talking on the teach us about Jesus, and sorry, group 1 and group 2, but Christ's focus and his calmness. So the sea is raging and he's calm, and the man that is bull goose loony and not able to be contained by man, Jesus is calm and doesn't say, "What's wrong with you?" He knows what's wrong. He knows inside. And then the woman, I note the crowd that was pushing on him, and that would cause me anxiety. But yet he's calm and still is focused and addresses what needs to be addressed. And then with the daughter, he's not anxious because she's died and, oh no, I'm too late. He's in control, he's focused, and just if we have him with us, how well are we going to be off?
Thank you, Albert. Calmness in the face of anxiety and stresses all around. In the crowds, as well as in the storm and in the face of the demons, right? Brian, last word here, group 2.
For what it's worth, Jairus' daughter was 12 years old, and the woman suffering the hemorrhaging had suffered for 12 years. So they coincided with each other.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll throw this in now because Brian mentioned that. There's actually been a couple of teachings on this somewhat recently. Steve preached a sermon called "What You Believe Always Shows Up in What You Do." That's July of this year, when he preached on these two stories together, some of the connections. And then I preached a sermon called "Made Well" in April of 2018. And in that, I put these two stories together, and as Brian pointed out, there's several kind of odd, or may seem like they're odd, connections between these two stories. First of all, this is what some people call a Markan sandwich. Okay, it's a sandwich story that Mark likes to do this kind of thing, where he starts telling one story, and then he throws in another story, and then he comes back and wraps up the first story. Okay, it's a sandwich. And the point of doing that is to show you that the stories are connected somehow, and that there are common themes that are supposed to be put together and then, understood in more clarity. Okay, and especially these two stories. I'll give you the quick list of connections here with just these two. This is in group 2, the healing and the raising. They both, Jairus and the woman, fall down before Jesus. He refers to the woman as daughter after she's been healed. It is Jairus' daughter who is raised. As Brian mentioned, 12 years of this flow of blood. By the way, it's almost certainly menstrual bleeding, which we'll come back to in a second. She's had it for 12 years, and the girl is 12 years old. Because of her condition, according to the law, she's unclean and would have been outcast from the synagogue, whereas Jairus is a synagogue official, so like the exact opposite of an outcast from the synagogue. He's the head guy. Both of them are told to not be afraid. They're both said to have been made well. They both had faith, and in both instances, the crowd has questions, doesn't understand what's going on. Okay? So the stories that are intended to be put together. So thank you to everybody for that. And as it really has already been referred to several times, and I figured you would, and I'm glad that you did. Really, all 4 of these stories are tied together by some important themes. So for one, these are 4 impossible situations, okay? In the first story, the disciples are positive, in verse 38 of chapter 4, they are certain that they are dying. We are perishing, okay? There's no other alternative. We're dead, okay? In the story of the legion, remember it said, no one could contain him. No one could do anything about him. There's no hope for him. With the woman with the flow of blood, she had spent her money on all these doctors and had not gotten any cure. She's only been made worse. And then with Jairus' daughter, she's dead. Like dead, right? Not like mostly dead from Princess Bride. She's dead. And everyone is laughing at him at Jesus saying, what are you talking about? She's asleep. She's dead. There's nothing you can do. So 4 impossible situations, and yet in each one of them, of course, Jesus has the answer. We've already talked about the fear that runs through each of these scenarios, but I will say this, that if you look closely, not all fear is the same fear in these stories, okay? The people that see the legion of demons cast out, they are afraid, and what do? They run away, they send Jesus away. Whereas the woman with the flow of blood, when she's healed, she's terrified. But yet what does she do in her trembling, her fear and trembling? She comes back. Thank you, Dan. She comes back and falls down before Jesus. There is a certain type of fear that causes us to run away from Jesus, and there's a certain type of fear that causes us to run to Jesus and fall at his feet and say, who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? That's right. That's right. She confessed what she had done, why she had done it, her faith in Jesus, and was praised and healed for that. Okay? We kind of talked about this. Actually, Jim was telling me this in our group discussion, that there is in each of these stories some confusion about Jesus. Who then is this, right? In chapter 4, the people don't like Jesus casting out these demons, and maybe they don't like him getting rid of all the pigs, and so they send him away. Who are you saying? Or why are you saying who touched you, Jesus? The crowd is all around you. And then finally, laughing at Jesus for wanting to go in and saying that the daughter is asleep. So there's confusion. People don't understand Jesus. Faith plays a major role in each of these stories. And then this one's already been said, actually in both groups. And I just think it's awesome. Okay. It may be a little bit hard to do this because we're reading the story on paper here. But if you read through this and imagine what's going on, there is a lot of noisy scenes in these stories, right? I mean, just try to hear and imagine the sound of the wind and the waves and the lightning and how powerfully noisy that is, and of course, how stressful that is, okay? Or in chapter 5, the sound of this man yelling and screaming. I don't know if because he had lots of demons, you could hear all of their voices. I mean, it's kind of creepy thinking about it, but you hear multiple voices kind of talking at once, or this guy, just one guy is loud and crazy and yelling and out of control, as already been said. There's just chaos and noise, and the noise of the crowd. Everyone's, chattering and talking as they go through the noisy streets to Jairus' daughter's house, okay? And then, no one mentioned this one, but I think it fits in. When they got to the house of Jairus, it says in verse 38, that they came to the house and Jesus saw the commotion and the people loudly crying and wailing. Whether these are professional mourners that have been hired to do this, or whether this is just the family and friends, they're wailing and they're yelling. There's a commotion over the death of this girl. Chaos, noise, stress, anxiety. And yet each story ends, really, with a moment of quiet, okay, the calm seas, the man sitting and clothed in his right mind at the feet of Jesus. The crowd probably, I'm assuming, hushed and stilled as this woman comes before Jesus and confesses what she's done. And then that quiet, tender moment of Jairus and his wife holding their little girl now raised from the dead, right? Stillness and quiet and calm and wholeness after the noise and the chaos of what has just transpired, okay? So each of the stories fit together, I think, in that way. What does it tell us? Again, you guys have really hit all of these already. What do we learn about Jesus? Dan was really getting at this in his comment, right? That Jesus is more powerful than anything. And I love that these 4 miracles, back to back, I guess, show us 4 different sources of fear and danger in the natural world, in the spiritual world, sickness and death. And each of these is for us a source of fear. And yet Jesus is more powerful than nature. I mean, he spoke it into existence, right? So to say be still is no big deal. He's more powerful than the demons. He commands them to go out. They have to ask him for permission to do anything, and he grants it to them. He is more powerful and more authoritative than they are. He is more powerful than the sickness. No other doctor could cure it, but the great physician could. And of course, he is more powerful than death. And so with each of these, any source of our fear, whatever category it's in, Jesus is more powerful. And he speaks calmness and order into the noise and the chaos, right? And I'll just say this, because I always think about these stories and I think, well, you know, good for them, right? Their sickness was healed. Their storm was calm. There's no guarantee that my sickness is going to be healed or that my storm will be calm. But some of you actually commented on this. There's a beauty here in these stories that even in the midst of the difficulty, even in the midst of the trial, Jesus is a source of peace and calm. I mean, after all, what is he doing in the midst of the storm on the sea? He's taking a nap, right? I mean, to me, that's a picture of, even if the storm is not calmed, even if we have this trial raging around us and don't even receive the deliverance that these people received in these miracles, we're still with Jesus. We're still in the boat with Jesus. And so there is still peace, and there is still calm. And of course, there is ultimate deliverance when Jesus comes back and he finally heals all of creation, sets all things right, and delivers and saves his people, and resurrects us and gives us new bodies that will never die again, and so on. But even now, in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the fear and anxiety, there is peace if we are in the boat with Jesus. And so we need, on one hand, fear, to recognize Jesus for who he is, to recognize his power, to stand in awe of him, to fall down in trembling at his feet, and then to confess that he is our only hope, to confess that we believe in him, that we trust him, and that we are willing to do whatever it is that he says. In particular, in this story, we have a kind of a contrast between the disciples who are in fear of him and who still trust in him, even though their faith is weak at times. And they get to go around with him and travel and follow him, be in his little posse, But then you have the legion, the guy with the demons. When he's cured, what does he want to do? He wants to go with Jesus. And Jesus says, no, can't have 13. I already got 12, Instead, he tells the man, go and tell everyone. By the way, if you didn't notice this is kind of a side point, but it's a very powerful one. Notice in verse 19 of Mark chapter 5, what Jesus tells him is to go and report to your people what great things the Lord has done for you. That is God, right? Go tell them what the Lord has done for you. And in verse 20, it says the guy goes and preaches in the Decapolis what? What great things Jesus had done for him, right? He says, go tell them what God did for you. And so he goes around and says, this is what Jesus did for me. And that's exactly what he was supposed to do, because Jesus is God in the flesh, of course. But his task was to go out and tell all about what God had done for him. And that's our task as well, to follow Jesus like the disciples, to go and tell like this man. But once we have thrown ourselves at the feet of Jesus, total trust in him, acknowledging he's our only hope, then we get up and we follow his command. We do what he tells us to do. Okay? Any more comments or questions here about these particular applications or other applications, responses you want to throw into the mix here? Oh, thank you, Brian. I thought Nathan was getting ready.
I just find it interesting that he went to the Gadarenes, which appears to be a Gentile land. Obviously, they're raising swine, 2,000 of them, and obviously that's unclean meat for the Hebrews. So already Jesus, when he preaches around Galilee, that's a Gentile/Jewish land, but the Gadarenes seem to be more of a Gentile land, and so already the word is going out to the Gentiles as well as the Jews.
Oh, thank you, Brian. And the Decapolis, where this man goes and tells, that is definitely Gentile territory. And so Jesus, you can see maybe the plan here to plant seeds with this man and then get him to go out into Gentile territory and tell them about Jesus. Albert?
Something that just hit me from the reading is the very last verse in 43, and he said that something should be given to her to eat. It's just, this great thing has been done, but yet he's still so aware. And as parents, I would be totally lost and so celebratory and just totally wrapped up. And Jesus is yet calm, and you need to get her something to eat.
Yeah.
So he knows what is needed,
Yeah.
and tells us what we should do.
Amen. Yeah, I love that part. Thank you. Anything else? Mark 5, the 4 great miracles. Okay. Well, here's what I have for you so far. Okay, I should hear 50 furiously scribbling pens and pencils for the quiz next week. Although Rick's teaching for me next week. We're going to be in New York visiting my brother. So it's up to Rick whether he gives you a quiz or not. But I think this is like kind of bad cop, good cop. I think Rick's the nice teacher. I'm the mean teacher. So he may not give you a quiz, right? All right. Mark 1, we said, was Jesus announcing his kingdom of healing and freedom. The kingdom is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. Authority to cast out demons, to rebuke fevers, and it's a kingdom of healing and freedom. Mark 2 and 3, people are objecting. Jesus is coming as the great physician to eat with sinners and tax collectors, to make sinners whole, to give Sabbath rest to those who are burdened by sin. And people, namely the Jewish leaders, object to Jesus' mission for some of those reasons. In Mark chapter 4, then, he tells parables. Remember, the parables are kind of like to put a veil, in some ways, over the truth of the message, so that those who are prideful and stubborn will have reason to reject what Jesus is teaching, whereas those who are humble and seeking and earnest will look for it, and theirs is the good and honest heart that will receive the message of the kingdom, and the kingdom will bear fruit in their lives as it bears fruit and grows throughout the whole world. And then here in Mark chapter 5, Jesus, King Jesus, demonstrates his overwhelming authority over nature, demons, sickness, and death, bringing peace to the noise, bringing order to the chaos, and bringing calmness to the troubles of our hearts. And that's Mark 1 through 5. And there's 2 classes in a row. We finished before the bell rings, so you're welcome. Thank you, everybody. Rick will pick up in chapter 6 next week.